Has this ever happened to you? The moment you realized that closure never truly came, that no matter how many words were spoken, how many letters were written, or how many tears were shed, something remained suspended in the invisible space between what was and what could never be again. Mature women often come to this realization not through bitterness, but through a quiet, almost sacred wisdom. They no longer chase the full stop at the end of life's unfinished sentences, for they have learned that some stories are meant to stay open, not as wounds but as portals to deeper understanding. There is an ancient knowing that arises when a woman stops demanding closure. It is the beginning of detachment, not the cold withdrawal that the ego confuses with strength, but a luminous calm born of seeing things as they are. Carl Jung would call this the work of individuation, the process of integrating the fragments of the self, of walking the long inner path where shadow meets consciousness. A woman who no longer seeks to tidy every emotional loose end has entered the territory of the self. She has seen through the illusion that resolution is something others can give her. She once believed, like most of us, that if someone apologized, if they understood, if the past could be explained, she might finally rest. But in the quiet hours of her solitude, she discovered the deeper truth. Closure is not an event. It is a state of consciousness, and the need for it is the ego's way of avoiding transformation. The moment she no longer begged the world to complete her story, something within her began to unfold, softly, silently, like dawn breaking over the ruins of an old life. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Detachment, in its highest form, is not emotional numbness. It is radical awareness. It is the moment the mature woman stops trying to control how others see her, or what they choose to finish or leave undone. She no longer bargains with the past. She observes it with compassion. She can look at the one who hurt her and say, not aloud, but inwardly, "You too were lost." This inner detachment is the quiet rebellion of the awakened feminine. It is the refusal to let the ego feed on unfinished symphonies. She understands that life itself rarely closes its doors neatly. Relationships dissolve, words remain unsaid, and meanings shift like shadows under changing light. The immature mind calls this unfair. The wise heart calls it life. There was a time when she sought justice in love, when she wanted the scales to balance, the apologies to arrive, the truth to be confessed. But she now sees that the desire for closure was really a disguised hunger, for validation, for control over how her story would be remembered. It was the shadow of pride whispering that peace could be purchased if only someone else would understand. But peace, she learned, does not come from being understood. It comes from understanding herself. When she finally stopped asking why, the silence grew kind. That silence, at first unbearable, became her greatest teacher. In the stillness, she began to see that every person who left her life was not taking something away, but revealing where she was still clinging. Every unanswered message, every unresolved ending was the universe's way of returning her to her own center. For the first time, she began to trust that no door truly closes when one is whole within. The Stoics knew this too. Seneca wrote, "He suffers more than necessary, who suffers before it is necessary." To seek closure from others is to suffer twice, once for the wound and again for the illusion that another person can heal it. Detachment does not mean indifference. It means no longer waiting for someone else to complete the story that was always hers to write. And so, she began to see endings not as walls, but as thresholds. To detach is to see the invisible architecture of meaning that exists beyond loss. Jung called this the symbolic life, the ability to see that every ending carries the seed of transformation. She began to notice how grief ripened her insight, how heartbreak softened her judgment, how silence became a sacred echo that revealed her own voice. Have you ever felt that kind of silence? The kind that does not demand explanation, that does not ache for finality, but instead expands into vastness. That is the silence of detachment. It is where you begin to feel the self, that exists beyond roles, beyond stories, beyond the approval of others. For most, it comes after great pain. For the mature woman, it comes as a second birth. She has cried enough, begged enough, hoped enough. Now, she simply watches. She does not chase closure because she no longer lives in the illusion that anything in life is ever truly closed. The river moves, and she moves with it. In her stillness, she discovers the secret. Closure was never the goal. Wholeness was. And that wholeness is not found in endings. It lives in the sacred continuity of becoming. The woman who no longer seeks closure is not heartless. She is free. Imagine this. A woman sitting by the window at dusk, the room dimly lit, her hands resting softly on her lap. Outside, the world hums with the quiet ache of endings, the sun sinking, a day folding into night. She watches, not with longing, but with a kind of serene understanding that only comes after losing what she once thought she couldn't live without. She no longer resists the setting sun. She knows that it must fall before light returns. This is the wisdom of detachment, a grace learned not in youth, but through the long apprenticeship of heartbreak, disappointment, and surrender. The mature woman does not seek closure because she no longer fears incompleteness. She has lived long enough to know that the soul itself is a moving river, never fixed, never finished. Carl Jung might say that she has entered the second half of life, the inward journey where meaning replaces ambition and peace replaces pursuit. In this phase, she begins to see that the human need for clear endings comes from the ego's hunger for control. The ego wants to define, to name, to finalize. But the soul does not think in such straight lines. The soul speaks in circles. She remembers the days when she demanded answers. Why he left, why things broke, why love dissolved into silence. Now she realizes that why is the mind's attempt to dominate mystery. The deeper self does not seek explanation, it seeks integration. The pain that once begged for closure has become the soil from which awareness grows. What was once confusion now feels like compassion. She looks back not to reopen wounds, but to understand what part of herself those wounds were trying to reveal. There is a Jungian paradox at play. The moment she stops trying to close the wound, it begins to heal. In allowing ambiguity, she opens herself to the unconscious wisdom that lives beneath reason. She has begun to dream differently, images of water, of thresholds, of shadows turning into light. Jung would call this the language of the self, the great orchestrator of the psyche, that leads her toward wholeness through the symbols of loss. At times, she still feels the pull of old desires, to text the one who never answered, to demand acknowledgement, to revisit what was left unsaid. But she breathes through it. She has learned that these impulses are the ego's way of seeking reassurance that it still matters. Instead, she chooses to remain in the tension between what she knows and what she cannot know. That is detachment. Not avoidance, but staying with the uncertainty until it no longer burns. Have you ever noticed how the need for closure fades when you stop identifying with your pain? When you realize that what you truly mourn is not the person, but the story you built around them, the illusion of completion they represented? The mature woman has learned to mourn not the ending itself, but her own attachment to the fantasy of control. She lets the story dissolve into symbol, as Jung would advise, allowing it to point toward what it always meant to reveal: her own capacity for self-love, her own depth of spirit. The Stoics wrote of amor fati, the love of one's fate, to love even the things that did not go as planned, to embrace the unfinished, the unresolved, the imperfect, as necessary to the design of the soul. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Accept whatever comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny, for what could more aptly fit your needs?" The woman who lives by this wisdom does not close her chapters. She lets them remain open because she has faith that what is meant to unfold will do so in time. And in this surrender, something remarkable happens. She begins to see that what she once called loss was, in truth, initiation. Every unanswered question led her closer to herself. Every departure stripped away another illusion. Every silence taught her how to listen. This is not resignation. It is awakening. The immature heart thinks that letting go means defeat. The awakened heart knows it means alignment. Through the Jungian lens, her detachment signifies a reconciliation of opposites within her psyche. The ego's need for finality yields to the soul's understanding of paradox. The inner masculine, animus, that once sought clarity and definition, now bows to the inner feminine, anima, which moves in mystery and fluidity. She no longer needs to conquer her emotions. She listens to them, honors them, then releases them into the flow of time. You may think detachment sounds lonely, but it isn't. It's freedom. It's the moment when love stops being a transaction and becomes a state of being. She loves, not to possess or to prove, but because love is her nature. When she releases others from her expectations, she also releases herself. No longer bound to the cycles of emotional debt, she moves lightly through the world, like water through stone. In her quiet wisdom, she has become the archetype of the sage, the woman who no longer clings, who no longer explains. Her strength lies in her softness, her certainty in her surrender. And though the world may never understand her calm, she no longer needs it to. Most women spend the first half of their lives trying to holding on to love, to approval, to certainty, to the illusion that they can prevent pain if they just understand it. But the mature woman has crossed the invisible threshold where understanding no longer means control. She has learned through the sacred ache of living that clarity often arrives only after she stops demanding it. The need to tie every emotional thread into a neat knot once felt like safety, but now she knows it was a cage, a way to keep the ego from dying its necessary death. Jung spoke of this death as an initiation. To individuate, to become who one truly is, requires the disintegration of who one pretended to be. And nothing disintegrates the false self faster than the realization that closure never truly comes. The endings that she once resisted were not punishments. They were invitations to step beyond identity. Every heartbreak was the psyche's way of saying, "You have outgrown this version of yourself." There was a time when she could not accept that truth. She would replay conversations endlessly in her mind, trying to rewrite them into something that made sense. She wanted fairness, reciprocity, justice, but the universe, in its ruthless kindness, withheld those things from her. It forced her to meet herself in the silence. It stripped her of illusions until she saw that the need for closure was really the fear of facing the void, the space where no answers exist, and yet everything is possible. You might recognize that void. It is the moment after loss when time slows, and the soul stands naked before its own reflection. There is no distraction left, no story to cling to, no audience to perform for, just the raw hum of being. Most run from that space seeking new love, new distractions, new validations. But she learned to stay, to let the emptiness speak, to listen to what her own silence was trying to say. That is where detachment begins, not in indifference but in intimacy with the unknown. She no longer rushes to close the book, because she understands that each page, even the painful ones, contains symbols that guide her deeper into herself. Jung would call these archetypal encounters, moments when life confronts us with the figures of our unconscious. The lover, the orphan, the warrior, the sage, each demanding recognition. Closure would end their dialogue prematurely. Detachment allows them to finish speaking in their own time. Through these encounters, the mature woman becomes her own interpreter. She begins to see patterns that once enslaved her. She notices how she always fell for those who mirrored her unhealed parts, how she chased validation in the same form, but different faces. The shadow, once denied, now stands beside her like an old companion. She no longer fears it. She sees that every rejection she suffered was her shadow's way of showing her where she was still seeking love, outside herself. When she no longer runs from the shadow, detachment transforms into compassion. She can look at the one who betrayed her and see the wounded child within him. She can bless the situation that once broke her, because she now knows that it forged her wisdom. The fire that once consumed her became the light by which she sees. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and that privilege requires loss. It requires the dismantling of every illusion that promised completion through another." The Stoics would nod in agreement. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from things themselves, but from the judgments we attach to them. The mature woman has learned this truth firsthand. She no longer labels her endings as failures. She sees them as natural transitions in the rhythm of existence. The desire for closure, she understands, is the ego's rebellion against impermanence. But impermanence is the law of life. To resist it is to resist the flow of being itself. There is a strange peace that comes when one stops resisting. It is not the peace of certainty, but of acceptance. She no longer waits for anyone to come back, or for explanations that may never arrive. Instead, she tends to her inner garden. She waters her solitude. She learns to find joy not in completion, but in continuity. Her happiness is not dependent on resolution. It arises from presence. Have you ever reached that quiet knowing? When you stop chasing what left and begin nurturing what remains. That is the shift from ego to essence, from attachment to wisdom. You stop needing the story to end neatly, because you realize you were never meant to be a character trapped in one chapter. You are the author learning to trust the unfolding. In that trust, she becomes luminous. People sense it when she walks into a room. There's a calm gravity to her presence, a softness that feels both strong and untouchable. She no longer explains herself. Her energy speaks for her. This is the woman who has known sorrow and turned it into serenity. She has learned the art of letting things end without closing her heart. And so, she continues, not chasing, not clinging, but moving through life as one who understands that nothing is ever truly lost. What dissolves in form remains in essence. What departs in body lingers in meaning, and meaning is enough. There is a moment in every mature woman's life when she realizes that peace was never hidden in understanding. It was hidden in surrender. That moment rarely arrives gently. It usually comes after everything she clung to has slipped through her hands, the relationship she tried to fix, the closure she never received, the apology that never came. And in the space left behind, something unexpected appears, a stillness that feels almost holy. It is here that detachment reveals its truest form, not as rejection of love, but as alignment with truth. In that stillness, she begins to see the deeper architecture of endings. What she once called chaos was, in fact, order working from a higher plane. The patterns that seemed cruel were sacred designs meant to dismantle her illusions. Jung would say that the self, the organizing center of the psyche, creates life experiences that force the ego into humility. When the ego collapses, the soul can emerge. For the mature woman, every ending that lacked closure was a sacred dismemberment, a breaking open that made room for something vaster than personal desire. She now moves through the world differently. When something ends, she no longer asks, "Why me?" but rather, "What is this trying to show me?" That question marks her initiation into wisdom. She has learned to observe her emotions as waves, not commands. Anger, grief, longing, all are visitors, not definitions. Jung called this the practice of holding the tension of opposites, the ability to feel deeply without being consumed. She does not suppress her emotions. She allows them to flow through her like water polishing stone. This is not detachment as avoidance. It is participation without possession. She engages with life, but she no longer tries to own its outcomes. The more she releases, the more she receives. Paradoxically, her detachment makes her more present, more capable of love. Because she is no longer addicted to certainty, she can love without fear. She does not say, "Stay," but rather, "Be free." And in that freedom, love becomes real. You might think this kind of detachment makes her unreachable, but in truth, it makes her profoundly human. She feels everything, but nothing owns her. Her compassion expands beyond her personal story. She sees the pain in others and recognizes its echo in her own journey. Jung wrote that, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The mature woman knows that every soul she's met, lover, friend, stranger, was a catalyst in her alchemical process. None were accidents. All were mirrors. In time, she realizes that closure is not a single door closing behind her, but countless small awakenings opening within her. The man who walked away without a word taught her self-respect. The betrayal that shattered her trust taught her discernment. The silence that once felt unbearable became the space where her soul could breathe. Each unfinished story was a piece of her initiation into wholeness. The Stoics would call this eudaimonia, living in accordance with the deeper nature of the soul. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." When she stops replaying old narratives, the suffering dissolves, and only wisdom remains. She no longer interprets life through the lens of good or bad, but through the quiet understanding that everything belongs. Even pain has its rightful place in the architecture of the self. Sometimes, as she moves through her day, a memory will surface, an image, a voice, a scent, and she will feel the faint ache of what never found closure. But instead of resisting, she breathes into it. She says softly, "You are allowed to exist." That acceptance transforms the ache into peace. Jung would call this integration, the reclaiming of lost fragments of the psyche. She no longer splits her past into light and shadow. She holds it all in her arms and calls it hers. Have you ever felt that shift? The moment when your pain no longer needs an explanation? When it simply becomes part of your depth? That is when you begin to live symbolically, to see meaning instead of misfortune. The woman who once begged for clarity now lives by mystery. She no longer fears what she cannot define, because she has become intimate with the unseen. The unconscious, once a source of confusion, now feels like an ally whispering through her intuition. And in that communion with the unknown, she discovers serenity that cannot be taken. People may come and go, words may remain unsaid, endings may stay open, but her center holds. This is the true fruit of detachment, inner stability born from surrender to impermanence. She no longer builds her home in what can vanish. She builds it in the quiet, in the stillness that follows understanding, in the sacred rhythm of release. When she looks back now, she does not see broken chapters. She sees evolution. Every unanswered question became a stepping stone. Every silence shaped her strength. Every departure widened her capacity to love without need. The woman who no longer seeks closure has become the embodiment of wisdom itself, a living paradox of softness and power. She walks through the world not seeking to possess, but to witness, not needing to resolve, but to understand. And it is in that understanding that she becomes untouchable, not because she has hardened, but because she has returned to her essence, the eternal part of her that was never wounded to begin with. There is something sacred about the woman who has stopped waiting. She no longer lingers at closed doors or reopens old chapters, hoping for a different ending. She has made peace with the unspoken, the unfinished, the unresolved. This is not resignation, it is transcendence. She has discovered what mystics and psychologists alike have always known, that closure is not found in others' words, but in one's own consciousness. In Jungian terms, she has crossed the threshold between ego and self, between the outer world of appearances and the inner world of symbols. What once looked like loss was actually initiation into her own depth. The endings she once fought were not punishments. They were invitations to individuate, to become whole. The Jungian self does not crave tidy conclusions. It craves integration. And in that integration, the woman learns that everything she tried to close off, the pain, the longing, the confusion, was actually the bridge to her higher awareness. She used to live with the illusion that detachment meant absence, that it was something cold and distant. But now she knows that true detachment is the most intimate form of connection possible. It is the kind that loves without owning, that gives without expectation, that holds space without trying to fix. This is the highest expression of love, the kind that no longer chains the beloved to the ego's desires. She understands what Jung meant when he said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power." Detachment frees her to love purely, without control. You may think this sounds like a kind of emotional ascension, but it is not. It is deeply human, deeply embodied. She still feels profoundly. But her feelings no longer dictate her freedom. She has learned to sit with her own vulnerability without running from it. The mature woman has stopped confusing attachment with devotion and detachment with indifference. She knows that real strength lies in being fully open to life and yet unbound by it. The Stoics echoed this truth centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The woman who has learned detachment has mastered this art. When people leave, she lets them. When misunderstandings arise, she no longer rushes to defend herself. She has outgrown the compulsion to be right, to be seen, to be understood. Her peace no longer depends on the approval of others. It depends on her alignment with truth. This alignment gives her a new kind of beauty, an energy that cannot be imitated. She radiates quiet assurance, the kind that makes others feel safe without knowing why. It is not charm or effort. It is the gravity of someone who has faced herself and no longer fears what she sees. Jung might say that she has integrated her shadow, the disowned parts of herself that once sought recognition through others. Now those same shadows have become her allies, her wisdom, her depth. In moments of reflection, she smiles at the paradox of it all, how the very things she once thought would destroy her have become the foundation of her peace. The abandonment that once broke her heart taught her self-trust. The unanswered questions became her teachers in patience. The endings that once terrified her now feel like gentle seasons changing. She no longer demands permanence in a world made of flux. She dances with impermanence like an old friend. Have you ever noticed that peace feels unfamiliar at first? That after years of chasing closure, silence can seem unnerving, until it becomes your home? This is what the mature woman knows. She no longer needs the noise of resolution. She can sit in the quiet and feel whole. Because the truth is, closure was never the door she was trying to open. What she truly wanted was connection, to herself, to meaning, to the invisible rhythm of existence that flows beneath every loss. And so, she begins to live differently. She speaks less, listens more. Her words carry weight because they rise from stillness, not reaction. When someone misunderstands her, she smiles gently, because she no longer confuses misunderstanding with injustice. When love appears, she welcomes it, but she does not cling. When it fades, she lets it go with gratitude. She lives according to what both Jung and the Stoics knew, that the soul's peace depends not on what happens, but on how deeply one perceives it. Her detachment is not escape, it is mastery. She has learned to walk through the world as both participant and witness. She feels the tenderness of life's impermanence without being destroyed by it. She understands that everything, every meeting, every loss, every silence is part of the soul's choreography. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is random. Each moment exists to deepen her awareness of who she truly is beneath the stories and scars. In that awareness, she finds liberation. She is no longer waiting for closure because she no longer lives inside the illusion of separation. She has seen through it, the way the ocean sees through its own waves. She has become one with the movement of life itself. The woman who once sought finality now embodies flow. And as she moves through this vast and uncertain world, her very presence becomes a quiet revelation that peace is not the reward for resolution, but the companion of surrender. There comes a time when the mature woman no longer wonders what could have been. The ache that once followed her like a ghost has softened into wisdom. She no longer seeks to close the door on her past, because she has learned that nothing truly ends, it only transforms. This is the final lesson of detachment, that what we call closure is merely the ego's attempt to stop the flow of life, while the soul's work is to keep the river moving. When she looks back now, it is not with regret, but with reverence. Every love that faltered, every friendship that faded, every silence that lingered, each was a mirror reflecting her evolution. What she once mistook for abandonment was, in truth, liberation from what no longer aligned with her becoming. Jung would say that the self has its own agenda, a quiet, divine intelligence guiding her toward wholeness through whatever experiences are necessary. When she stopped fighting that design, life began to reveal its quiet symmetry. She walks now with a different kind of grace, one that does not demand to be seen, It's the grace of a soul that no longer clings. There is no bitterness left in her voice when she speaks of the past, only gentleness. She understands that those who could not stay were never meant to. They came as messengers, each carrying a fragment of the truth she needed to remember. The lesson was never about them. It was always about returning to herself. The Jungian path of individuation has no final destination. It is a spiral, not a straight line. The mature woman has learned to move with that spiral, embracing her own unfolding with patience. Detachment has taught her that life's beauty lies not in permanence, but in participation. She no longer seeks to preserve moments. She simply inhabits them fully. When love comes, she receives it without fear. When it leaves, she lets it go without sorrow. Both are sacred, both are gifts. You can feel this kind of freedom. It's almost luminous. It's the freedom that comes when nothing outside of you has the power to disturb your peace. She is no longer addicted to resolution, because she has become resolution itself. The conflicts that once consumed her no longer require answers. They have dissolved into understanding. Jung wrote that the soul becomes more beautiful as it embraces more of itself. That is what has happened to her. Through every open ending, she has gathered the lost pieces of her soul and brought them home. She now lives as one who trusts the intelligence of her own becoming. She no longer fears uncertainty. It feels like breathing. She does not chase clarity from others, because she has learned to see through the eyes of the self, where everything is already clear. In stillness, she perceives what the mind could never grasp, that every relationship, every ending, every silence has served her growth perfectly. There was never a mistake, only movement toward consciousness. And in this realization, she discovers what the Stoics and the mystics both tried to teach, that peace is not found in controlling life, but in consenting to it. The Stoic sage and the individuated soul meet here, in the same serene space of acceptance. Epictetus said, "Do not seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for them to happen as they do, and you will go on well." The woman who has embraced detachment lives by that truth. Her heart remains open, but her happiness is no longer conditional. She has become her own closure. The longing that once reached outward now turns inward, where it finds its source. She no longer asks others to explain why they left, because she has learned to listen to what their absence revealed. She no longer revisits old wounds, searching for understanding, because she has already become the understanding itself. She has outgrown the need for linear endings in a world made of infinite cycles. If you look at her now, you might see a softness in her gaze, a calm that seems timeless. It is the calm of someone who has died many small deaths and been reborn through each one. She carries no resentment, no rush, no need to prove. Life moves through her effortlessly because she no longer resists its impermanence. She has surrendered not out of defeat, but out of devotion to the mystery, to the unfolding, to the eternal becoming of her own soul. And so, the woman who once sought closure has become something greater, a mirror of life's wisdom itself. She has learned that the true ending is never an ending at all, but an awakening, the quiet return to one's center, where peace does not depend on circumstances, where love needs no object, and where wholeness simply is. In the end, detachment is not the absence of love. It is love purified of need. It is freedom without indifference, compassion without control, and peace without condition. It is the wisdom of knowing that you lose nothing that was ever truly yours, and that what remains after everything else has fallen away. Is the self, radiant and whole, and in that awareness she smiles because she finally understands. Closure was never the point. Becoming was. Thank you for spending this time with us. Your journey gives life to this channel. Stay with us, and together we'll keep exploring, growing, and discovering the truths that shape the soul. Until the next video, take care and see you soon.